The folding chair was digging into my spine, and I had been sitting in it for 40 minutes before the dean even started reading names. My name is Mara. I'm 34 years old. I work as a structural engineer in Dayton, Ohio, and on the day my sister graduated from law school, I sat in the third row of an auditorium that smelled like overheated coffee and somebody's too strong perfume, watching my father's shoulders shake. He wasn't shaking from pride. Not the kind you clap for. I'd seen my father cry exactly twice before in my life, once at his own father's funeral, once when our dog died when I was 11. This was a third kind of crying, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than the moment itself, and even from 4 seats away I understood, with a cold, sliding certainty, that none of it was about Brooke walking across that stage in her cap and gown. It was about something else. Something that had been building since I was 19 years old and stood in our kitchen with a financial aid letter in my hand, watching my mother wipe down a counter that was already clean. I didn't know yet what I would learn 3 weeks later. I didn't know about the second mortgage or the account at Fifth Third Bank that had quietly existed since I was in high school, or the conversation my father had with my sister's law school advisor that nobody had ever mentioned to me. All I knew, sitting in that auditorium with my palms damp against the program in my lap, was that my father was crying in a way I had never seen, and some old, familiar ache in my chest, one I thought I'd made peace with 15 years ago, had just woken up. I clapped when Brooke's name was called. I meant it, mostly. She'd worked hard. I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But I watched my father reach for my mother's hand, watched him press his knuckles against his mouth, and I thought, I graduated too. Nobody cried at mine. I pushed the thought down the way I always did. I'd gotten good at that, burying things under the next obligation, the next task, the next reason to be useful instead of felt. By the time the ceremony ended and we were all hugging in the lobby under a banner that said "Congratulations, graduates" in gold letters, I had already smiled my way back into composure. What I didn't know is that the smile wouldn't last. 3 weeks from that day, I would be standing in my parents' garage, holding a banker's box I wasn't supposed to find, looking at numbers that would unravel 15 years of a story I'd told myself about my own family. A story where I was simply the responsible one, the strong one, the one who didn't need help. I would learn that there is a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being forgotten, but from being quietly, deliberately set aside while everyone insists you were never set aside at all. I grew up in Kettering, a quiet suburb just south of Dayton, in a house with green shutters and a maple tree in the front yard that my father had planted the year I was born. We weren't wealthy, not by any stretch. My father worked 31 years at a tooling plant before it closed in 2009, and my mother kept the books for a dental practice 3 towns over. Money in our house was something discussed in low voices after we kids were supposed to be asleep, a current running under the floorboards that you felt more than heard. Brooke is 7 years younger than me. For most of my childhood, that gap meant I was less her sister than a smaller, less competent version of a parent, the one who walked her to the bus stop, who helped her sound out words in her early reading books, who sat with her during thunderstorms because our parents both worked nights some weeks and somebody had to. I didn't resent it, not then. It felt like purpose. It felt like the role I was good at, the one where I mattered. When I was 17, our father lost his job for 4 months during a plant retooling. I remember the specific tightness in the house during that stretch, not loud, never loud, but present in the way my mother recalculated grocery lists out loud, in the way my father stopped buying the brand of coffee he liked and switched to whatever was on sale. I started babysitting for 3 families on our street to help cover my own expenses without being asked. Nobody asked me to. I did it because I already understood, at 17, that being the kind of daughter who created problems was a luxury this family couldn't afford. And being the kind who solved them was something I could offer instead of love I wasn't sure how to ask for directly. That instinct solve, don't ask, followed me into adulthood like a shadow I'd stopped noticing. When I got into Ohio State's engineering program, the financial aid letter covered about 60% of the cost. I remember standing in the kitchen, 19 years old, watching my mother wipe down a counter that didn't need wiping, waiting for her to say something about the rest. She didn't. My father came in from the garage, looked at the letter over my shoulder, and said, "You're a smart girl, Mara. You'll figure it out. You always do." I did figure it out. Work study, a part-time job at a hardware store on Far Hilliard, a patchwork of small scholarships I found by staying up late searching databases other kids didn't bother with. I graduated with $11,000 in loans, which I paid off in 6 years by living in a studio apartment above a laundromat and driving a Honda Civic with 200,000 miles on it. I was proud of that. I told people that story like it was a badge. I did it myself. I believed, fully and without resentment, that this was simply how our family worked. We didn't have extra. Everyone managed their own. So when Brooke turned 18 and announced she wanted to go to law school eventually, starting with a 4-year degree at Miami University, a private school, nearly 3 times what I'd paid, and our parents said yes without the kitchen counter silence I remembered. Without a single conversation about loans or work study or figuring it out, I told myself a story to make that fit. Things are different now. Dad's pension came through. Mom got that raise. They're older, more settled. It's not that they love her more, it's that they have more now. I told myself that story for 15 years. I told it so many times it stopped feeling like a story and started feeling like fact. I should say something here about who I am, because I think it matters for what comes later. I am, by most people's accounting, the reliable one. The one who remembers birthdays 3 weeks in advance and orders the cake. The one who flew home 4 times in the year before our grandmother died, who organized the estate paperwork, who sat with our mother in hospital waiting rooms and brought her coffee in the exact way she liked it without being asked. I built a life around being indispensable, and for a long time, I mistook that indispensability for closeness. I thought if I held everything together carefully enough, the love underneath it didn't need to be examined too closely. It was just assumed to be there, the way you assume the floor will hold you if you've never fallen through it. I didn't marry. Not because nobody asked. There was a man, David, for almost 4 years in my late 20s, kind and patient in a way I didn't fully appreciate until after he was gone. He used to tell me, gently, that I treated my family like a job I couldn't quit. I used to tell him he didn't understand how families like mine worked. Looking back now, I think we were both partly right, and that the distance between those two truths was exactly where the relationship went to die. My sister, by contrast, was the one who needed managing. Brilliant, genuinely, undeniably brilliant, but scattered in the particular way of someone who has never had to learn consequences because someone always materialized to handle them before they landed. She missed flights and someone rebooked them. She lost a job in her early 20s for chronic lateness, and our parents called it finding her footing. When I lost a job, laid off during a downturn at 26, my father's only comment was, "Well, you'll land on your feet." You always do. I used to find a kind of comfort in that phrase. You always do. It felt like a compliment dressed as a fact. It took me years, longer than it should have, to understand that it wasn't praise. It was a release. It was my father telling me, in the gentlest possible language, that I had been quietly excused from needing him. The day after the graduation, my mother called to ask if I could come help close up the house. They were doing a small remodel of the garage for storage, and she wanted help sorting through boxes before the contractor started. I said yes immediately. Of course I said yes. I always said yes. Saying yes was the entire architecture of how I understood my place in this family. I drove the 2 hours from Dayton to Kettering on a Saturday in late May, windows down, the kind of early summer air that still has a chill underneath the warmth. My mother had coffee ready when I arrived, and for the first hour we worked companionably, sorting old holiday decorations into keep and donate piles, laughing at a box of my father's college textbooks he'd never once opened again. It was in the back corner of the garage, behind a stack of paint cans, that I found the banker's box. It wasn't hidden, exactly, nothing about it suggested concealment. It was simply old, water-stained at one corner, the kind of box that gets pushed to the back of a space and forgotten precisely because nobody is trying to protect what's inside it. I almost didn't open it. I almost set it directly into the donate pile, the way you do with anything anonymous enough to look disposable. But the top flap had come loose, and a single sheet of paper had slid halfway out, and on it I saw a bank logo I recognized, Fifth Third, and beneath it, a column of numbers that didn't belong to any account I knew my parents to have. I want to be honest about what happened next, because this is the part of the story where I made a choice I'm not proud of, and I think the choice matters as much as the discovery. I could have set the paper down. I could have asked my mother, directly, standing right there in the garage with the smell of old paint and cardboard around us. What is this? That would have been the honest thing. The brave thing. Instead, I opened the box. There were statements going back almost 16 years. An account opened the spring I turned 19, the same spring I stood in that kitchen with my financial aid letter, watching my mother wipe a clean counter. The balance in the earliest statement was modest, a few $1,000s. But it grew steadily, year over year, through deposits that arrived with a kind of discipline I recognized because it was the same discipline I'd applied to my own loan payments. $200 here, $300 there. A larger deposit, $11,000, the year my father's plant closed, and he took an early severance package I'd always understood to be modest. I sat down on an overturned bucket in the corner of that garage and went through every statement in order, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. My mind doing the particular kind of arithmetic that exists specifically to keep you from feeling something too large too quickly. By the time Brooke turned 18, the account held just over $41,000. The withdrawals began that fall, tuition-sized withdrawals, semester after semester, for years of Miami University and then, more recently, 3 years of law school payments that I recognized immediately because the numbers matched almost exactly what I'd watched my sister casually mention over family dinners, the way you'd mention the weather. There was no statement, no withdrawal, no deposit anywhere in that box with my name on it. I want to tell you I cried. I didn't, not then. What I felt instead was a strange, hollow quiet, the kind of silence that exists right before a sound, when you already know something is coming, but your body hasn't caught up to the knowledge yet. I remember the smell of the garage with unreasonable clarity, sawdust, old rubber from a stack of tires, the particular mustiness of cardboard that's been damp and dried more than once. I remember a single beam of sunlight cutting through the high window and landing exactly on the edge of the box, like a spotlight on evidence in a trial nobody had told me I was part of. Something tightened in my chest, low and sudden, the way it does right before you understand you're about to fall. I didn't know yet what this meant. I only knew, with the specific clarity of a fact arriving before its context, that I had built an entire understanding of my family on a story that was not true. I put the lid back on the box. I carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table, in front of my mother, and I asked the only question I could manage. "What is this?" She looked at the box. She looked at me. And in the half-second before she answered, I watched something pass behind her eyes that I would spend the next several weeks trying to name. Not surprise, exactly. Something closer to resignation. The look of someone who has been waiting for a very long time, for a door she'd kept quietly shut to finally come open. My mother's answer, when it finally came, was almost worse than silence. "It's not what you think," she said, which is, I would learn, the exact phrase people use right before confirming that it is precisely what you think. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd done homework for 12 years, where we'd eaten birthday cakes and argued about curfews, and she told me, in a voice that stayed level the entire time, about an account she and my father had opened the year I turned 19. A just-in-case account, she called it. Money set aside from my father's overtime, from her bookkeeping side work, from a small inheritance when her aunt passed. Money that had, over 16 years, become Brooke's tuition. "Why didn't I know about this?" I said. Not a question, really. I didn't have the energy to lift it into one. "You never needed it the way she did," my mother said. "You always managed." There it was again. You always managed. The same phrase, dressed differently, that had followed me since I was 17 years old, babysitting 3 doors down, so I wouldn't be one more mouth my parents had to stretch a budget around. I felt something rise in my throat, not tears, something closer to disbelief, and I pushed it back down the way I always did, because the kitchen suddenly felt very small, and I did not trust what would come out of me if I let it. I didn't confront my father that day. I told myself it was because he wasn't home yet, out running errands, and that was true. But it was also true that some old, well-worn part of me was already calculating how to absorb this quietly, how to fold it into the existing shape of things without causing a disruption. I drove back to Dayton that evening with the radio off, the whole 2 hours, turning the numbers over and over like stones in my pocket. For the next several days, I went back to my normal life with a strange, doubled awareness, going through my work at the engineering firm, reviewing load calculations on a mixed-use development downtown, nodding through meetings, while underneath all of it ran a current I couldn't switch off. I noticed things about myself I hadn't before. The way I skipped lunch twice that week without registering I'd done it. The way I woke at 3 a.m. on Tuesday and lay there for an hour, doing math in my head that didn't need doing again. I'd already done it in the garage. I told myself, repeatedly, that this didn't have to mean what it felt like it meant. Parents help different children differently. Brooke had needed more structure, more support. Maybe that extended to money too. I built a dozen versions of a story where this was reasonable, where I wasn't the overlooked daughter, but simply the more capable one, and capability had been mistaken, by everyone including me, for a kind of love that didn't require proof. I called my best friend, Priya, that Thursday night. We'd known each other since our 20s, since the apartment above the laundromat years, and she was the person I told things to that I didn't tell anyone else, or so I believed. I told her about the box, the account, the 16 years of withdrawals. I expected her to be outraged on my behalf, the way friends are supposed to be. Instead, there was a pause on the line that lasted a beat too long. "You didn't know about that," she said. Something cold moved through me. "Know about what, exactly?" Another pause. I thought it had come up before. I didn't realize it was, like, news. I didn't push her that night. I told myself she'd misunderstood the question, that there was an innocent explanation, the same way I'd been telling myself innocent explanations about my parents for 2 weeks. But I hung up the phone with a new, smaller ache layered on top of the larger one, and I lay awake a long time wondering what, exactly, had come up before and who had been in the room when it did. I went back to Kettering the following weekend, this time without being asked. My father was the one who answered the door, and something in his face when he saw me told me he already knew why I'd come. We sat on the back porch, the one he'd rebuilt himself the summer I was 22, and for a long time neither of us said anything. A neighbor's dog barked twice somewhere down the block. The evening had that particular gold light that makes everything look gentler than it is. "Your mother told me you found the box," he said finally. 16 years, Dad." He nodded slowly, looking out at the yard instead of at me. "It wasn't supposed to be a secret. It never came up. You never asked." Why would I ask about an account I didn't know existed? He didn't have an answer for that, not right away. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, quieter, rougher at the edges. "Your sister needed more than you did. She always did. You were always the one who could handle things. Brooke couldn't. Not the same way. So you decided I didn't need help because I never fell apart in front of you," I said. "That's not the same as not needing it, Dad. That's just me being good at hiding it." He flinched at that, slightly, and for a moment I thought he might actually say something real. Instead, he said, "We did what we thought was right at the time, and the conversation closed itself the way a door closes when somebody decides they're done standing in the doorway." I drove home that night with my chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with traffic. Somewhere on Route 35, I realized I was gripping the steering wheel hard enough that my knuckles had gone pale, and I made myself loosen my grip, finger by finger, the way you'd talk yourself down from something larger than a car ride. 2 weeks later, I learned the second thing. I was at a cousin's birthday dinner, a sprawling, loud family gathering at my aunt's house in Centerville, the kind where every relative within driving distance shows up and the volume in the room climbs steadily with the wine. I was in the kitchen, refilling a water glass, when I overheard my Aunt Carol talking to my uncle near the pantry, their voices low but not low enough. "Still can't believe Robert called the dean himself," Carol was saying. "Practically begged them to look at her application again after she got that rejection letter freshman year. Brooke never even knew." I stood very still, the faucet still running, water overflowing slightly from the glass in my hand. I waited until the dinner had wound down, until people were drifting toward dessert and coffee, before I found a moment alone with my aunt on the back patio. "Carol," I said, keeping my voice as even as I could manage. "What did you mean about Dad and the dean?" She looked at me, and I watched the realization land on her face that she'd said something she wasn't supposed to repeat. "Oh, Mara, I just assumed you knew. It was years ago. Brooke got rejected from her first choice program, and your dad, he called in some kind of favor, I don't know exactly what, an old colleague who knew someone in admissions. She got in on appeal a few weeks later. And nobody told me this either." Carol's face softened into something like pity, which was somehow worse than anything else she could have offered. "Honey, I think your parents they didn't want it to seem like favoritism. They probably thought keeping it quiet was kinder." I almost laughed. Not from humor, from the sheer, absurd architecture of it. 16 years of a secret account. A phone call to a college dean. A best friend who'd apparently known enough to be unsurprised. All of it kept quiet, supposedly, to spare my feelings, as if the secrecy itself hadn't been the precise thing doing the damage. I drove home that night doing the math again, except this time the math wasn't about dollars. It was about every dinner table conversation over 15 years where Brooke's struggles were narrated as obstacles and mine were narrated as evidence of strength. It was about every time my father said "you always manage," and I had heard it as a compliment instead of what it actually was, a quiet, repeated decision to direct his worry, his money, and apparently his phone calls toward the daughter he believed needed rescuing, while categorizing the other daughter as someone who simply didn't require it. I didn't sleep well that week. I'd find myself standing in my own kitchen at odd hours, not hungry, not really doing anything, just standing, as if my body needed a different room to process what my mind kept circling. I confronted Priya again, properly this time, on a Sunday afternoon over coffee at the place near her apartment where we'd been meeting for a decade. I asked her directly, "What did you know, and when did you know it?" She was quiet for a long moment, turning her cup slowly on the table. "A few years ago," she finally said. "Brooke mentioned the loan thing. Well, not loan, the help thing at your mom's birthday party. I figured you already knew. I didn't think it was my place to bring it up if you hadn't. You've known for years that my parents secretly funded my sister's entire education while I paid off loans by myself, and you decided that wasn't worth mentioning to me. Your best friend. I didn't think it was a secret, Mara. I thought it was just a thing that happened in your family that you'd made peace with." I made peace with a version of events that wasn't true. She didn't have an answer for that. We sat in a silence that felt different from any silence we'd shared before, not comfortable, not even particularly hostile, just a quiet acknowledgement that something between us had shifted and neither of us yet knew how far. I want to be honest here, because this is the part where I made my own mistake, the one I'd spend later weeks turning over. I let my anger at Priya bleed into things I wasn't certain of yet. I said something I shouldn't have, that maybe she'd stayed quiet because some small part of her liked being the one who knew more than I did, liked having something over me after years of being, in her words once, the friend who's always a little behind Mara. It wasn't entirely fair. I didn't have proof of that motive. I only had my own hurt, reaching for somewhere to land. She left the coffee shop without finishing her drink, and I sat there afterward with the specific, sour knowledge that I had said something true enough to wound and unfair enough to regret. By the end of that month, I had stopped sleeping through the night entirely. I'd lie awake replaying conversations, my father's voice on the porch, my aunt's voice by the pantry, Priya's voice across the coffee table, searching each one for a detail I might have missed. A piece that would make the whole picture less devastating than it had started to look. I didn't find one. What I found instead, lying awake at 2 a.m. with the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, was a question I hadn't let myself ask directly until then. If I had not found that box, would I have gone my entire life never knowing? And underneath that question, quieter, harder to look at directly, had some part of me always known, in the vague, unexamined way you know things you've decided not to look at too closely, and simply chosen the comfort of not confirming it? I thought about the financial aid letter at 19. I thought about my mother wiping that already clean counter. I thought about how quickly I had built a story that made my father's silence into practicality instead of what it actually was. I had been so good, for so long, at not asking questions that I had never noticed how much that habit had cost me, not just in money, but in the basic, unglamorous right to understand my own family accurately. I started gathering things after that. Not consciously, not at first. I told myself I was simply organizing, the way I organized everything, the way I'd organized our grandmother's estate 3 years earlier with color-coded folders and a spreadsheet nobody had asked me to make. I requested old tax documents I had copies of from my own loan years. I asked my mother, in a casual enough voice, for old family photos for a project and found among them a photograph from my 19th birthday, my father's hand on my shoulder, both of us smiling at the camera. Taken 3 months after he'd told me I'd figure it out myself, 2 months before that account had opened with its first deposit. I didn't yet know what I was building toward. I told myself it was just for my own understanding, a private accounting to settle something private inside me. It would take me another 2 weeks to admit that some part of me was preparing for a conversation I didn't yet have the courage to schedule, and that the version of myself doing all this careful, quiet gathering looked, uncomfortably, exactly like the version of myself who used to organize the family's holiday dinners and graduations and crises, the one who had always confused being useful with being loved, and who didn't yet know how to be anything else. The contractor started the garage remodel the second week of June, which meant I had a reason to come back to Kettering without it looking like what it actually was, a return to the scene, an excuse to keep my hands near the evidence. My mother had moved most of the remaining boxes into the spare bedroom that used to be mine before it became, somewhere in my 20s, the office, though nobody in our family had ever really used it as one. I told her I'd help finish sorting. She seemed grateful, almost relieved, the way people are grateful when you offer to do the thing that lets them avoid doing it themselves. I found the second account statement folder on a Tuesday, tucked inside a manila envelope marked, in my mother's handwriting, taxes, miscellaneous. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't hidden behind a false wall or buried under floorboards, the way these things sometimes are in the stories people tell. It was simply filed, the way unremarkable things are filed, because to my parents, by then, none of this had felt remarkable at all. It had become ordinary. That was the detail that sat with me longest, not the money itself, but the ordinariness of it, the casual administrative ease with which an entire decade and a half of unequal treatment had been folded into a life that otherwise looked, from any outside vantage point, like a perfectly normal, perfectly loving family. The envelope held something I hadn't expected, a letter, handwritten, dated almost 9 years earlier, from my father to my mother. They lived in the same house. I didn't understand at first why a letter would exist between two people who saw each other every day, until I read the first line and understood it wasn't meant to be spoken aloud. I know we said we'd tell Mara eventually. I keep putting it off. I don't know how to explain it to her without it sounding like what it is. I sat on the floor of my old bedroom with that letter in my hands for a long time. There was no good way to read those words. Either interpretation, that my father knew, even 9 years ago, what this looked like and chose silence anyway, or that he understood, on some level, that there wasn't an explanation that would make it not be what it was landed with the same weight. I didn't cry. I want to be honest that I kept waiting to, in those weeks, the way you wait for a storm you can see on the horizon, and it kept not arriving the way I expected. Instead, there was just a low, steady hum underneath everything I did, a tightness across my shoulders I couldn't stretch out, a habit of checking my phone for no reason, a sense that my own skin fit slightly wrong. I didn't tell my mother I'd found the letter. This was, I think now, the most questionable decision I made in the entire unraveling of that summer, not the anger, not even the things I'd say later that I'd wish I could take back, but this. I took a private letter between my parents, photographed it on my phone, and put it back exactly where I'd found it, and then I said nothing. I told myself I was being strategic. I told myself I needed all the pieces before I said anything to anyone, that confronting them too early, with too little, would let them control the story the way they'd controlled it for 16 years. There was truth in that reasoning. There was also something less flattering underneath it, the same old architecture, the same instinct to manage a crisis quietly and alone rather than let myself be seen mid-collapse, asking for help before I had a plan. I had spent so long being the daughter who didn't need rescuing that even now, in the middle of discovering exactly how much I had needed it, I couldn't bring myself to ask anyone to help me carry what I'd found. I called Priya once more that week, out of habit more than trust, and we had a short, careful conversation that neither of us tried to extend. We didn't repair anything. We didn't break further, either. It was the conversational equivalent of two people agreeing, without saying so, to let a bridge stand unused rather than burn it outright. I went to see my father alone again in early July, this time with the letter, printed out, folded, sitting in my bag the entire drive like a stone I couldn't put down. He was in the garage when I arrived, now mostly finished with the remodel, new shelving along one wall holding boxes I recognized from the sorting. He looked older to me that day than he had at the graduation, though it had only been a few weeks. Maybe I was just seeing him differently now. I found something else, I told him, and I handed him the printed letter without further explanation. I watched him read it. I watched the exact moment recognition crossed his face, followed by something that looked almost like relief, the specific relief of a person who has been carrying a private weight and is, finally, no longer the only one who knows what it says. I wrote that 9 years ago, he said quietly. I never sent it. I never even gave it to your mother, technically. I think I just needed to write it down somewhere, to make it real to myself. Did it ever feel real to you? What you were doing? He sat down slowly on an overturned bucket, the same one I realized that I had sat on in May, the day I found the box. I think I told myself a story where it wasn't about you at all, where it was just about her needing more. I don't think I let myself look directly at what that meant for you, because I knew if I did, I wouldn't be able to keep doing it the way we were doing it. It was the closest thing to an honest answer he'd given me yet, and it landed with more weight than I expected. Not because it excused anything it didn't, and some sharp, exhausted part of me wanted to tell him so right there in the garage, but because for the first time, he wasn't telling me I'd simply never needed help. He was telling me he had known, on some level, exactly what he was choosing not to see. I didn't say anything for a long moment. The garage smelled like fresh-cut lumber from the new shelving, a smell that should have felt clean and didn't. I need you to tell Mom I have the letter, I said finally. And I need both of you to be honest with me, actually honest, not managed honest, before the family gets together for the 4th. He nodded, slowly, and something in his face told me he understood exactly what I meant, and exactly how much was still unresolved between the saying of it and the doing. The week before the 4th of July, I barely slept. I'd lie in bed running through versions of the conversation I knew was coming, a family barbecue, the same backyard where I'd spent every summer of my childhood, now somehow about to become the site of something I couldn't fully picture yet. I lost my appetite almost entirely. I'd make food and then sit looking at it, unable to convince my body that eating mattered as much as it apparently used to. I went back through everything I'd gathered, the bank statements, photographs of the letter, dates I'd cross-referenced against my own loan payment history, against Brooke's law school timeline, against the year of my father's plant closure. I built a timeline, the same way I'd build a project timeline at work, because organizing the facts into rows and columns was the only way I knew how to hold something this large without it spilling over the edges of me. I called my mother twice that week. The first call, she was defensive in a brittle way I hadn't heard from her before, repeating variations of "we did what we thought was best" until the sentence stopped meaning anything at all. The second call, 2 days later, she was quieter, and at one point she said something that surprised me. I used to tell myself you were the strong one because it let me stop worrying about you. It was easier than admitting I just didn't know how to help you the way I helped her. I didn't respond to that right away. I wrote it down later in the same notebook where I'd been tracking dates and numbers because it didn't fit cleanly into the story I'd been building about deliberate favoritism. It complicated things. It suggested something closer to a slow, accumulating negligence dressed up, over years, as respect for my independence, which didn't make it hurt less, but it did make it harder to hold on to a clean, simple anger. Priya texted me 3 days before the 4th. Are you doing okay? I've been thinking about what I said and what I didn't say for years. I should have told you the truth a long time ago. I'm sorry. I didn't respond immediately. I sat with the message for a full day, turning it over. Part of me wanted to let the friendship go quietly, the way I'd let so many things go quietly over the years rather than have the harder conversation. But I thought about what I'd learned that summer, about silence dressed up as kindness, about people deciding on my behalf what I needed to know, and I realized that if I let this go without saying anything honest, I'd be repeating the exact pattern that had hurt me in the first place. I wrote back, "I'm not okay yet. I don't think I'm ready to pretend this didn't happen between us. But I don't want to lose you either. Can we actually talk, not just text after the 4th?" She agreed. It wasn't resolution. It was the beginning of one, which felt like the most honest thing I could offer either of us. The 4th of July arrived hot and bright, the kind of Ohio summer day where the air itself seems to hum. My parents' backyard filled with the usual crowd, aunts, uncles, cousins, a few neighbors who'd been coming to this barbecue for longer than I'd been alive. Brooke arrived with her new boyfriend, a quiet, polite man named Theo who kept refilling people's drinks before they asked, the kind of nervous helpfulness you adopt when you're trying to be liked by a family you don't know yet. I'd told my father I needed honesty before this gathering, not during it, and to his credit, he and my mother had sat with me the night before a long, difficult conversation in their living room that covered most of what I already knew, plus a few details I hadn't, that the account had, at one point, been intended for both of us before a string of small decisions, none individually dramatic, had quietly redirected all of it toward Brooke, that my father had, in fact, called an old colleague to intervene with the admissions office, a call he described, with visible discomfort, as the kind of thing I told myself wasn't really cheating, because I never lied to anyone's face. I listened to all of it without raising my voice, taking the kind of careful, deliberate notes I might take in a work meeting, because some part of me had decided, somewhere in the gathering of evidence, that I would not let this happen the way it always happened. Managed quietly, absorbed without consequence. I didn't expect Theo, Brooke's boyfriend, to be the one who said something during the actual barbecue. But late in the afternoon, standing near the grill with a plate of food he hadn't started eating, he said to my father, with the easy obliviousness of someone newly arriving into a family's history, "Brooke told me about the law school thing. That's wild, how much you guys did for her education. I told her she's lucky my parents couldn't help with any of mine." The yard didn't go silent exactly, but something in the air shifted, the way it does right before weather changes. My father's face went through several expressions in quick succession, surprised that the topic had surfaced this way, in front of people, without warning, and underneath that, something that looked almost like dread. I felt the old instinct rise immediately, smooth this over, redirect, protect the gathering from discomfort the way I always had. I felt my mouth already shaping the words that would do it. I didn't say them. Instead, I put my own plate down on the table, and I said, evenly enough that I surprised myself, "It's true. They covered all of Brooke's tuition for 7 years. I paid off my own loans for 6. Nobody ever told me about the account until I found it myself, 3 weeks ago, in a box in the garage." The yard did go quiet then. My Aunt Carol's face went pale. She clearly hadn't expected her earlier slip to surface like this, in front of everyone. Brooke's expression cracked into something between shock and humiliation. My mother set down a serving spoon with a small, sharp clatter against the table. My father looked at me across the yard, and for one long moment, neither of us said anything. "Mara," he said finally, quietly, "maybe we should talk about this inside." "We've had inside conversations for 16 years, Dad," I said. "I think it's allowed to exist outside one, just this once." Nobody moved for what felt like a long time, though it was probably only a few seconds. Theo, realizing belatedly the size of what he'd stumbled into, set his plate down very carefully and took a step back toward the fence, as if physical distance might undo what he'd already said. My father walked toward me across the yard, and I noticed, in the strange hyper-attentive way you notice details during moments like this, that the grass needed mowing, that someone's radio was still playing faintly from a few yards over, that my hands had gone completely steady in a way the rest of me hadn't. "You didn't have to do that in front of everyone," he said, low enough that it was mostly between us, though half the yard was still watching. I didn't plan to, I said. But I'm done being the one who manages how comfortable a room stays. I've been doing that my whole life, and it cost me 16 years of not knowing the truth about my own family. My mother had come up beside him by then, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, a posture I recognized from every difficult conversation of my childhood, the one she used when she was bracing rather than engaging. "We can talk about this without an audience," she said. "You had 16 years to talk about it without an audience," I said, and I heard my own voice rise slightly, heard something in it I didn't entirely recognize, not the careful, modulated tone I used in client meetings, not the gentle deflection I used at every family gathering for as long as I could remember. Something raw. "You had a letter, Dad. 9 years ago. You knew exactly what this looked like, and you decided writing it down to yourself was enough, that you didn't actually have to face me with it." I watched something flicker across his face, not denial exactly. He didn't try to claim ignorance, the way I half expected him to. What he did instead was worse, in its way. He started and stopped 3 different sentences, each one trailing off before it became an actual defense. "Brooke needed," he started, then stopped. "I know what Brooke needed," I said. "I've known what Brooke needed since I was 11 years old, walking her home from the bus stop because nobody else could. What I'm asking is what I needed, and why none of you ever once asked yourselves that question." "You never asked for help," my mother said, and there it was, the same sentence, again, in a slightly different shape, as if repeating it enough times might eventually make it sound less like an excuse. "I didn't ask," I said, because I'd already learned, by 19, that asking wasn't something this family rewarded. I learned that the way to be loved here was to need nothing. So I built a whole life around needing nothing, and somewhere along the way, you all started believing the performance was the truth. My father's face had gone pale, and for a moment I thought he might simply walk away, into the house, away from the yard, away from the version of this conversation that had an audience. Instead, he did something I hadn't expected. He sat down, heavily, in one of the folding chairs near the grill, and put his head in his hands. "I called the dean because I was terrified," he said, his voice muffled. "I was terrified she'd fail, the way I felt like I'd failed when the plant closed. I needed her to make it, because somewhere in my head, if she made it, it meant I hadn't completely failed as a father. I didn't think about what that meant for you, because you'd never given me a reason to worry the same way. That's not an excuse. I know that's not an excuse. It's the truest thing I can tell you right now. It wasn't everything." I understood that even as he said it, that there were still pieces he wasn't saying, reasons buried under reasons, the kind of partial honesty people offer when the whole truth is more than they can survive saying out loud in front of family on a holiday. But it was more than he'd given me in the garage, more than the porch conversation in May, and something in me recognized that this was likely as far as he could go today, in this yard, in front of these people. I felt the anger still sitting hot in my chest, but underneath it, something else had started to settle, not forgiveness, not yet, but a kind of clarity I hadn't had access to an hour earlier. "I'm not staying for dessert," I said, to no one in particular and everyone at once. "I need to go." Brooke caught up with me at my car, her face still blotchy from the shock of the last 20 minutes. "Mara, I swear I didn't know it was that bad. I didn't know about the letter." "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. "But I need you to understand something. You're going to have to decide, now that you do know, what kind of sister and what kind of daughter you want to be in a family that did this. That's not my decision to make for you any more than it was fair for everyone else to make decisions about what I needed to know." She didn't have an answer for that. I didn't wait for one. I got in my car and drove the 2 hours back to Dayton with the windows down the entire way, the summer air loud against my ears, and somewhere around the county line, I finally cried, not the storm I'd been bracing for all month, but something quieter and longer. The kind of crying that comes less from a single wound than from the slow recognition of how long you've been carrying one without naming it. It took most of the rest of that summer to understand what I actually wanted from my family, now that the story I'd told myself about us no longer held. My father called twice in the 2 weeks after the 4th. I let both calls go to voicemail. Not out of spite, I want to be honest about that, but because I genuinely didn't know what I'd say yet, and I'd spent 34 years saying things before I knew what I meant, smoothing situations over before I'd given myself room to actually feel them. I was, for the first time I could remember, letting a silence exist without rushing to fill it. When I finally called him back, in late July, the conversation was shorter than I expected and quieter. He didn't ask me to forgive him. I think some part of him understood that asking would have made it about his relief rather than my healing. Instead, he said, "I'd like to find a way to make this right, even if I don't know yet what that looks like. I don't expect you to tell me right now." It wasn't everything I wanted. But it was the first time in this entire unraveling that someone in my family had offered me space instead of asking me to provide it. My mother and I talked more slowly over several conversations through August, mostly on the phone, mostly short. She apologized once, plainly, without qualifying it, "I'm sorry, Mara." I told myself a story that let me feel better about something I should have faced directly. That was wrong of me. It was the only apology of the entire summer that didn't come wrapped in justification, and I noticed how much lighter it felt to receive, simply because it didn't ask anything of me in return. Brooke and I spoke twice before she started her job in Columbus. The second conversation was harder than the first. She tried, gently, to suggest that maybe I was being a little hard on Mom and Dad, considering they're getting older, and I told her, as evenly as I could, that I needed her to sit with the discomfort of this rather than smooth it over on our parents' behalf, the way everyone in this family had always smoothed things over on someone's behalf. She got quiet. I think it landed, even if it didn't land easily. I didn't go back to managing the family the way I used to. That was, I think, the largest single change, not a single dramatic act, but a long string of small refusals. I didn't organize Thanksgiving that year. I told my mother she and Brooke could handle it, and I'd come as a guest, which felt, the first time I said it out loud, like a foreign language. I stopped being the one who remembered every birthday 3 weeks out. I let a few slip past without orchestrating anything, and the sky did not fall, and nobody loved me less for it, which was, itself, a strange kind of grief, realizing how much of my usefulness had never actually been required to keep their love intact. It had only ever been required to keep mine intact. I went back to therapy that fall, something I'd tried once in my late 20s and quit after a few sessions because, at the time, I didn't think I had anything serious enough to justify the hour. I understood things differently now. I talked for months about the particular loneliness of being the child nobody worried about, not because you never gave them cause, but because you'd trained them, carefully and without meaning to, never to look. Priya and I did eventually talk, really talk, on a Sunday afternoon in September. She told me, more honestly than she had on the phone in June, that some part of her had stayed quiet over the years because she hadn't wanted to be the one who disrupted the image of my family that I seemed so invested in protecting, an image, she said, gently, that she'd always suspected cost me more than I let on. We didn't return to exactly what we'd been before. We built something slightly different, slightly more honest, which felt, in its own way, like an upgrade rather than a loss. I think about the graduation sometimes, still, my father's shoulders shaking in that auditorium, the tears I assumed, at the time, were simple pride. I understand now what I think they actually were, relief and guilt, arriving together in a body that had spent 16 years trying not to feel either one too closely. I don't think he knew, watching Brooke cross that stage, that I would find the box 3 weeks later. I think he cried because some part of him already knew what was buried in that garage, and some part of him had been waiting, quietly, for the day it would finally be found. I didn't get the tuition back. I never asked for it, and I don't think I will. What I wanted, in the end, wasn't restitution, it was simply the truth, spoken plainly, by the people who'd kept it from me. I got most of that, eventually, in pieces, across a long, uneven summer that cost all of us something. I'm 35 now. I moved into a new apartment last spring, the first home I've ever furnished entirely for myself rather than for the version of myself I thought other people needed. I still see my family, Thanksgiving, the occasional Sunday call, Brooke's wedding next spring, which I've been asked to be a part of and have agreed to, carefully, on my own terms. But I no longer mistake being useful for being loved. I no longer organize my worth around how much weight I can carry quietly. Some nights I still think about that banker's box in the garage corner, water-stained at one edge, easy to overlook. I think about how close I came to never opening it, to spending the rest of my life inside a story that was kind to everyone except me. I'm glad, now, that I looked. Not because the truth was easy, because it was finally, after 16 years, mine. The most painful detail in this story is not the money. It's the phrase, "you always manage," repeated across 16 years like a verdict disguised as a compliment, until a daughter built an entire identity around never needing anything, simply because needing had never once been rewarded. What this family demonstrates, underneath the specific facts of tuition and bank accounts, is how unevenly worry gets distributed inside a household, and how that distribution gets mistaken, by everyone involved, for love itself. Robert didn't direct 16 years of resources toward Brooke because he loved her more. He directed them toward whichever daughter activated his own fear of failure as a provider. Mara's composure didn't protect her from that fear, it simply made her invisible to it. The quieter, more functioning child becomes a kind of blind spot precisely because she never generates the alarm that pulls attention toward the other one. The accumulation effect matters here as much as any single decision. No single year of withholding information was, on its own, a betrayal large enough to name. It was the compounding of small, individually defensible choices. Don't bring it up at this dinner, don't mention it before this milestone, let her find out when it makes sense, that turned into something closer to active concealment, even though no one moment was engineered with that intent. This is often how the deepest familial betrayals work, not through a single cruel decision, but through years of smaller ones that nobody individually felt brave enough or honest enough to interrupt. Ellen's late admission, that she told herself a story to feel better about something she should have faced directly, is the closest the story comes to naming the actual mechanism at work. Self-deception, inside families, rarely announces itself as deception. It dresses itself as kindness, as practicality, as not wanting to cause unnecessary pain. But the pain doesn't disappear when it's deferred. It accumulates interest, the same way Robert's secret account did, and it eventually comes due to someone who never agreed to the terms. Mara's growth isn't measured by an apology she receives or money she recovers, because she receives only partial versions of both. It's measured by the smaller, harder shift in how she organizes her own worth afterward, refusing to run Thanksgiving, letting a birthday pass unmanaged, going to therapy instead of organizing her way through the grief. The real point of no return in this story isn't the confrontation at the barbecue. It's the quiet decision, weeks later, to stop being indispensable, because that role, however well it had served the family, had never once required her actual feelings to be safe to have. What stays with me most about this story is how ordinary the betrayal looked from the inside, filed in a manila folder marked taxes, miscellaneous, tucked behind paint cans, never dramatic enough to announce itself. Most family wounds don't arrive as a single cruel act. They accumulate in plain sight, disguised as practicality, as not wanting to make a fuss, as everyone agreeing it's kinder not to say anything. It makes me wonder how many of us are the manageable one in our own families, the child nobody worries about, not because we're fine, but because we never let anyone see otherwise. And whether that role, however safe it feels, is actually costing us the very thing we're trying to earn by playing it. Mara didn't get restitution. She got something quieter and, in its way, harder one, the right to stop performing strength as a substitute for being known. That's not a small thing. Sometimes the bravest moment in a story like this isn't the confrontation, it's the silence afterward, when you finally let yourself need something and wait to see who actually shows up.